Sweet. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Scolace. I'm a principal at Bora Architecture and Interiors here in Portland. We're a practice of about 60 people in Southeast. We do mostly public work, schools, higher ed buildings, good amount of affordable housing, and really wanted to share some lessons kind of across the spectrum of that work with you all today. My personal background is in community organizing. That's how I came into architecture. That led me to co-housing design, that led me to affordable housing, but it was all kind of these threads of community facilitation and engagement, which was part of why I was so excited when I finally got to meet Irene. And she agreed to do this conversation with me. So that, I'm gonna let Irene kind of introduce the session a little bit and herself, and then we'll jump into it.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm not used to holding a mic, so this is going to feel a little awkward, but I have a background in architecture and community design undergrad, but I would say I'm an urban planner and specializing in equitable engagement. So my hope is that we can really transform engagement practices that has really historically been very transactional and pretty exclusive of communities who are mostly disproportionately impacted by a lot of public decision making. And I'm really interested in just kind of flipping the script and really focusing on engagement practices that really start and end with building relationships, building capacity, and transparency and accountability. So that's my career goal. Just a little bit about our firm. I'm a partner at Cascadia Partners. This is a very nice photo of us. It's not all of us, but some of us. We are a Portland-based urban planning firm. We mostly work on public projects. So I would say like 99% of our projects are with public agencies. And we work across the spectrum: land use, housing policy, real estate development, development feasibility studies. We work on environmental projects as well and do engagement in-house kind of across the board. So yeah, Brian very graciously asked me to present with him and on this really important topic and about design justice and equitable engagement. So thank you all for being here, and nice to see this crowd. So our goal for today is to provide, I'm going to stand up because this is like, I can't see folks everywhere, but our goal for today is to provide a framework and best practices on, what design justice and equitable engagement could look like in affordable housing development. So Brian's going to talk a little bit about design justice theory, what that looks like in design and development, and I'll be speaking to more best practices and approaches around engagement, and kind of how we get to design justice through engagement. So really asking the question, like, what are some ways we can transform how we do engagement in affordable housing development and get us closer to designing for justice and equity? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian to start us off.
All right. I guess I'll stand up too. We've started a thing now where we stand up. All right. This looks self-explanatory. We'll find out. So I think it sounded really concise when Irene just explained that. I'm probably going to blow it up a little bit more and meander through a conversation. And then Irene's going to pull it all back together into like things you can do. So please bear with me. Design justice in general, right? The intention here wasn't just like, yes, let's do engagement. We're a practice that does a lot of engagement. And like I said, I've done it for a long time. And in 2017, I had my eyes really opened by an RFP that we got from Portland Community College. And in that RFP, they said they wanted us to change how we work to change what we build. And it was just this light bulb moment that we hadn't been inviting all voices to the table, right? We had done the best we could, and we had worked with the stakeholders that the client brought or the stakeholders that we already knew, but we hadn't dug deep enough in a lot of the engagement we were doing, right? And so the whole intention behind design justice is to bring justice through the design process. For every systemic injustice that's out there, there's an architecture to support it. Like, look at any building, you will see spaces that communicate horrible, horrible things to the people that are in them, right? And that's based on the bias of the designers coming to the table. That's based on the way that we are trained. That's based into the belief systems that we have all bought into or been trained into to varying degrees, right? And so this was that moment where we got to unpack that just a little bit and say, how can we flip that script, right? How can we leverage these conversations to push back against those injustices and to empower the communities to lead with their voices, to inform us as designers how to realize the things that will best support and benefit them. And we were lucky enough to be successful in that pursuit for Portland Community College. This was for a workforce training center that we'll talk about a little more depth shortly, that ended up being much more than a workforce training center. But this image here was the first 2 days of that project. We had roughly 40 people sitting together, talking about our personal social identities, how that related to the work that we do, the work that we want to do, the way we want to engage with communities. It was all of our design team, our lighting designer, our engineers, our landscape architects, Portland Community College, and the representatives from their various departments. We had 4 different community engagement specialists, kind of each with different roles on that project at the table for those conversations. Many of them were people that I had worked with for years. And I would ask questions about how their kids were doing or what'd you do this weekend, right? And I thought I knew these people and I didn't know these people. And I still don't know these people, right? Like what does that mean? How much time do you really have to invest? But having that opportunity to kick off the project with that level of transparency just set us on a trajectory for the rest of the development where there was a level of openness and honesty and something we could reflect back on when we felt like we were moving away from that openness to kind of pull us back into that conversation and that relationship together, which ended up being really impactful and meaningful. And as we step into the design, I think kind of the biggest acknowledgement, if you're going to take one thing from my portion, at least of this conversation today, it's this, like these 4 big bold words right here. Space is not neutral, right? Every decision we make, every decision we don't make unintentionally, the way that we lay our biases into these spaces communicate things to the people that are using the buildings, to the communities that are in the buildings. And again, the more intention we can bring into it, the deeper we can dig in with the communities we're serving, the better off we're all going to be in the end. Is the hope. This is a theory. We still stumble, right? That is part of these conversations, is acknowledging when we do and working to do that repair work when we need to. I think this is one really concrete example that hopefully isn't new to anybody in this room, right? We've gotten generally pretty good at least talking about the gender binary within our reasonably progressive community and state. We can look at this photo and we can immediately see how this space is not neutral, how people who don't feel like they fit into the A or B category, the male or female category, don't know what to do and don't feel welcome and don't feel comfortable. When we dig a little deeper into it, right, we see that there are images of what a man and a woman looks like. We see that there are colors associated with what men and women are supposed to be or who they are, right? What kind of bullshit is this, right? You look even deeper into it, right? And there's a language bias, right? If you don't speak English, you can't read these signs and you are not welcome. You're not a first-class citizen in this place. These are just bathrooms, right? Somebody designed them. I don't think there was an evil intent. I've made mistakes in the designs I've made. I'm still making them, right? But like, unless we're having these conversations, we can't unpack these things. We can't change them on the next building that we design or the next space that we go into. Maybe this is poking the bear, and I apologize if so, but I don't really. I've never had a session with a community group or a group of residents, future prospective residents, current residents, they've told me what they really want is a locked community room. We all have locked community rooms. We've all seen them in too many buildings, right? Like, and this isn't to say there aren't really good reasons why community rooms get locked. It's not to say there aren't really good reasons why we end up with, security cameras that basically look like that. I've reviewed, construction submittals that pretty much look like that, right? And you have the conversation about safety and security and what it means to offer residents dignity. And what I've heard, and this is not representative of what we should do on every project, right? But talking to many people, is that security cameras feel great in a parking area or at the entrance to a building, right? They're appreciated by a lot of residents. When that security camera is in the corridor looking down the hallway at their unit entry door, that's often communicating something very different about the trust that we place in those residents, right? Again, not to say there aren't good reasons those cameras have ended up in these places, but it is to say we should be having deeper conversations about where we're going to put them on every project. And the response is going to be different with every group we're serving and every people we're working with, right? It goes deeper, space isn't neutral, but neither is the air we breathe and the chemicals we put into that air that we expect populations who are already experiencing higher levels of toxins in their environments to just perpetuate that cycle, right? So the social determinants of health, the cycles of health disparities are real, they've been acknowledged, and there are many, many leverage points that the design process and the decisions that we make collectively will have to impact these things. Each of the pink rectangles, are those points. It's the ways that we can positively or negatively impact those with PTSD, those with neurodiversity issues. We talk a lot about trauma-informed design, obviously. This is taking a trauma-informed approach, right? This is backing up to say, before we understand what that design is, what those patterns might be and how they need to be different in every project, we need to take a trauma-informed approach and work as close as we can with those communities through the engagement process to ask these questions, even though we feel like we know the community we're working with, right? Even though you have 12 properties in the same neighborhood, whatever it might be, the answers are going to be different every time. And there are questions that we haven't asked, right? And so it's a new opportunity to start fresh and to dig a little deeper and to rebuild a little bit of trust where maybe there hasn't been enough in the past. As we do that engagement, there's different ways to engage. There are different ways to center those lived experiences in the discussions. This is kind of an interpretation of Arnstein's ladder, which might be a diagram some of you are familiar with, but it kind of looks at different levels of engagement. It's not to say that going deeper is always better. It is to say we need to be intentional about who we invite to the table and how we engage with them in different ways if our intention is to center those lived experiences, right? So we might be informing a neighborhood association. We might be consulting kind of the next tier over with immediate neighbors where we're actually going to be kind of impacting the edge of their property, or doing a pre-designed focus group, right? That might be the kind of thing that we're going to sit down and consult with some people and get some initial ideas. As we get deeper into the project, we might put together a design advisory group. We might have 10 to 12 kind of, housing positive people that are coming to the table, that are representing service providers, future residents, prospective residents, current residents, right? And we might be having regular meetings with them. And then kind of the highest tier here is really that collaborate, right? It's that participatory design. It's our weekly owner, architect, contractor meetings, our design meetings, where historically it's usually the developers and the builder and the architect and their consultants at the table. And I would say that, we need to expand that group, right? We should have property management and resident services continually in those discussions, which is hard to build into all of their busy schedules, right? But like they need to be paid for and appreciated in those conversations and included if we're going to start to flip the script on some of these things and end up with spaces that don't have locked community rooms. We should also be inviting probably some of those, at least one or two of the representatives from that design advisory group to come to the table every week and be paid for their time and participate in those conversations and have an equal voice to the others at the table, right? If we're going to be investing in these people and in these communities, we need to really give them the seat at the table to give their best. Over the next, hopefully 7 or 8 minutes, what time is it? Okay, cool. We're gonna do a little kind of quick breeze through 4 different projects here. And just looking at the way that some of these have been interpreted and played out in the developments we've been working on, these are not all housing. The hope is that we can see what's happening in other areas and kind of draw from that and kind of think more broadly maybe about the way that we're doing engagement and outreach. So we'll look at that workforce training center, the Opportunity Center for Portland Community College. We're gonna look at a library that we have under construction right now, a co-housing community, and finally an affordable housing development that's under construction for Reach right now in Tigard. So here's some images of that workforce training center, the Opportunity Center. This is up on 42nd and Killingsworth in Northeast. The Opportunity Center just opened. PCC also has a land partnership. They offered the land to Home Forward to come in and put 85 affordable units on the site. That phase will start construction shortly. But this project was really the strength and the voices coming to the table were about the number of partners, right? And there were stumbling blocks along the way. There were moments where you're like, wow, do we really need this many people in the room for every conversation? And sometimes the answer was yes. And sometimes the answer was, maybe we'll think about that a little bit differently next time, just a little bit, right? But like, there's lessons learned. None of this was perfect, but the intention was to invite more people to the table. And so PCC obviously brought Home Forward right away. They brought Naya into the conversation, who's gonna be providing family services and helping to run the childcare in the housing building. We had 4 different partners related to the engagement and outreach efforts. We worked with Living Cully, we worked with Nelda from AB Cultural Drivers. Collocate was another design partner on the project. They are an architectural practice that focuses on design justice. They're initially based out of New Orleans, and because of this project, they ended up opening a Portland office. So they're around, and hopefully they'll be presenting here next year. They do amazing work. Hacker was brought in to do the affordable housing development, so we worked closely with them. And who's the other engagement partner I'm forgetting? Oh, Amada Perez, who was with PCC at the time, is now doing amazing work independently around town. Hopefully you cross paths with her, but she's really led the charge on translating kind of the impact of critical race theory or bringing the lens of critical race theory to spatial design. And how do we look deeper in acknowledging that there are systemic racial barriers in every system that we have, period, right? And let's start unpacking that and let's think about that in terms of architecture and design. But through those partnerships, we had all sorts of different modalities for the outreach. It was newsletters to the community. It was one-on-one conversations. It was surveys. It was large group discussions. It was open houses. It was ongoing monthly engagement with the staff that would be in the building to kind of come up with what is our trauma-informed approach to this project. So we're not just applying patterns that have been used before. we're coming into that. Also out of those conversations came this much broader realization that Adams High School had been torn down kitty corner to this site years prior, and there wasn't a good gathering space in the neighborhood. There's a lack of healthcare facilities in the area. There was lack of childcare in there, right? So all these conversations we had, PCC and Home Forward put their minds together and shifted the program of the buildings, right? And so there are there's not only a community room for the residents, but there's a public community room in the actual Opportunity Center. A lot of the recipients of the programs or participants in the programs here are TANF recipients who need to bring their families and their kids with them. So there's a family room and space for the kids to come be in the Opportunity Center. There's a health clinic on the ground floor. There's the child care. There's NIA doing family services, right? So it became this full spectrum kind of community-centered project, which was not the original brief. It wasn't excluded, but it wasn't, thought through enough, or the community's needs weren't understood enough to bring those things to the table day one. But they were once we'd listened and enacted that. I'm going to touch real quickly here on, this is a replacement library we're doing in Southeast Portland, the Holgate Library. It was, in a lot of ways, it was a very similar process. Worked again with Colocate. The really unique thing here is that Colocate put out a call for participants to submit their resumes and their applications to be part of a community design advocate cohort. These people were then paid for their time. They were given training in how to have design conversations and how to outreach within their communities. And then intentionally, the design team was not at every design conversation. These people then went out to their own communities multiple times per design phase to engage in the conversations that they thought would be most meaningful to their community. And it was our job to support them by providing the right presentation materials, design materials, things like that, so they could go have those conversations. And out of that, there's a whole slew of kind of changes to the design. One of the big ones was kind of a switch from thinking of a central circulation desk, which is traditional amongst most libraries. The staff are gatekeepers of the media, right? They check you out. They are a security point. We flipped instead to more of a retail model where the staff are there up front to help you navigate the space, to help you navigate the media and find what it is that you need. So just kind of that thought alone in shifting their role then informs the architecture and how that kind of plays out through the building. There's some great community art workshops that were directly then translated into the facade of the building in different ways that the art will be reflected in the building. That was certainly something we heard over and over in engagement conversations, right? This can be a space to house art that is reflective of the community. Shifting over and looking at housing a little bit, briefly here before we talk about affordable housing. So this, as I said, my background is in co-housing. I designed 25, 30 co-housing communities across the country. It is a bottom-up grassroots development style. In the traditional sense, co-housing has been a term that's been co-opted for a lot of different uses and ways over the last decade. The traditional Danish definition is that this is a community of private houses where you have your own kitchen. You are not, it's not co-living. It's different in that way. You have your own space. It is right-sized to your needs and in an intention so that you can get closer to your neighbors. And it is socially engineered in a way that you have common amenities that you are sharing. It's a pedestrian-friendly space, but it is all driven by the residents that want to live in this neighborhood. One household would reach out to us, and they might live in Oklahoma, they might live in Kansas, and we would then go out there and start giving presentations in a library or a church on what is this housing type and why would I do this? And we'd spend 2 years in kind of an iterative community building process. We'd bring a couple new households in, and then you do the next stage of design. They bring a couple more households in, and then you do the next stage of design. And so by the end of the 2 years, there was no question that we had built a community, right? And so this is early in my career. One of the things that it really just burned into me and my approach is that the buildings we design and are only going to be as successful as the strength of the bonds and the communities that we build in getting there, right? And any opportunity we can do to build those relationships during the design process, the less work we're putting onto resident services later. So thinking about the process is really an opportunity to do that. And there are challenges within our capital A affordable housing systems, right? To bringing those residents in or acknowledging who those residents might be. And there are also ways to get creative and work around that and have conversations about that. One of the sites that I can think of in the co-housing communities I designed was zoned for the purpose, was zoned for multifamily housing. This is the 12th public hearing that we had to go through for a project in Northern California. We finally brought 45 residents to the meeting with us. And when the city council members were looking at those residents, they approved the project, right? It was a very easy conversation when their constituents were sitting in front of them and they didn't have to wonder what type of political backlash there would be for switching to zoning on this property. Right, and all this is to result in wonderful pedestrian-friendly communities. The top center image here is actually an affordable housing development modeled off of co-housing. It was Affordable Housing Associates in Berkeley reached out to us and said, how do we do this? Like, let's have the conversation. You're not affordable housing experts. We're not social engineering community co-housing experts. Let's sit down and let's kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of it. And the project is still functioning really well. This is 10 years later. The residents do a decent amount of self-management on the property. There are lots of different ways of doing that. So I think there's some really interesting conversation lessons to be learned as we do move into capital A affordable housing and the conference that we're at right now. So this is, I'm way over my time, aren't I?
Good.
I'm good?
Yeah.
Yes. Cool. Okay. This is the development that is currently under construction with Reach right now. This is this is the capital stack that all of you are working with, I imagine, right? In its many, many permutations of 10, 12, 15 funding sources. This was the heat of the pandemic, and Reach came to the table and said, we really want to dig deep on the engagement and we want to work with you guys to do this. And we want to have some focus groups before pencil ever hits the paper. Right. And this is just like so wonderful, right? As soon as we start drawing, we're putting our biases on that paper. As soon as we start giving our contractors numbers to price, as important as it is, we're putting their biases on the paper, right? And then we have to unpack everything that we've just told people we were going to do. We've told ourselves we were going to do. And so we were able to have those focus groups from the beginning, even virtually, even during a pandemic. Out of those initial focus groups came a design advisory group, 10, 12 people that met multiple times through each phase of the project. We had time to have conversations about design justice and about critical race theory and about people's interpretations of space and what feels good and what feels welcoming and what doesn't to you, right? Banks and boardrooms and like all of these really intimidating spaces, schools, right? The way that they've been designed generation after generation. When you give people just 5 minutes to unpack that and think about that, they're like so many light bulb moments that were just really wonderful to see. We're also able to have really deep conversations about the challenges of affordable housing with this group, right? And to unpack like why we need to have efficient unit designs, why these units do need to be a little tight, but also how do we assure livability in the building, right? And the way we do that is by putting more amenity space into the building that can be shared. So we can still kind of get that gross reduction, but still assure that livability. And that community space can't just be one big room, especially if that one big room is going to be locked, right? So we had a lot of conversations and kind of came up with this diagram that we need spaces that serve group gathering as well as individuals to just find reprieve outside of their unit, right? When you come home from a busy day at work and you need to have a phone call or just collect yourself for a minute before walking into your apartment and being asked to make dinner and where's my soccer cleats and whatever else. These are the questions I get every day. You have that, right? And it doesn't have to be in your unit, and it certainly shouldn't be in your closet that you're going to spend those 5 minutes, but that's what we hear from residents over and over and over is you're in your bedroom or in your closet. And those community spaces also have to be zoned, right? From kind of quiet to active. So you have small spaces for reprieve, you have big spaces for gathering, you have medium spaces for 2 or 3 people to get together and have a conversation or do some knitting or whatever it might be, right? And so from that came these diagrams of kind of the site plan, looking at kind of the dark blue blobs there. It's probably a little legible from where you're sitting, but it were kind of the distribution of those amenity spaces. There are also many spaces distributed on the upper floors as well. We had a lot of conversations with Reach's property management team into how are we going to make these spaces work in a way that's going to be safe and secure. And they felt like it was a risk worth taking to try this on a development. The central community room is immediately adjacent to the property management and resident services suites. They have glazing looking out into those spaces. Right outside of those windows from those offices is a small tea bar and coffee bar, which is right next to the mail, right? So you're generating people hours, you're generating foot traffic in that space. People come, they get their mail, they grab a cup of tea, they bump it into resident services. Even if they don't want to have that conversation, there's still kind of eyes on that space at all times. The central circulation of the building is right there. That's the more active community room. There's a small classroom, which we heard there was a need for off of that space. It opens because that's the most active social space of the community amenities. It opens onto the most active social outdoor space. It opens onto the plaza, which is really public facing on the corner of the property right there. Then there's smaller lounges that are off of the play area that are intended, it has some laundry in it, but it also has craft tables that can be movable and storage for the crafts. And you could do movement classes in that space. There's a small corner of the plaza that is a little quieter, and there's a quieter lounge space off of that. So, right, it was connecting indoor spaces to outdoor spaces and make sure that their activity levels matched each other and provided a diversity of spaces for the residents to use when they're in there. A couple images, probably a little too small, but you can see kind of the tea bar, coffee bar immediately outside of the offices there. Kids spaces distributed through the building. but done in a way so that the acoustics are separate enough from the resident entries, right? So we can kind of control the noise, smaller kind of sitting areas, quieter nooks, things like that, kind of distributed throughout. And my most illegible and I think final image, which most construction documents are, right? Like construction documents are just like opaque to all of us, even those of us that were like trained in design and architecture. So this is kind of what they look like, regardless whether it's blurry or not. But the point being, we have to have these conversations and we have to keep having them and we have to keep having we have to keep having them, right? So like if we have the conversation, the community deserves to see it documented in a contract document. The contractor and their trade partner needs to see it in here so that they can understand the priorities of the community and the priorities that led to the design that was resulted, right? And so that when we do end up in a conversation about cost savings or time savings or whatever it is, we can reflect back on this with the contractor, with city planning, whoever it's going to be coming to the table, right? To say like, here's the priorities we heard. Like we understand the pressure that we're under, and yes, we need to make changes, and we're at the table to make those changes with you collectively, but these are non-negotiables and or these are the priorities that we heard, right? And so we've got to work within those parameters to kind of figure this out for everybody. So with that, there are some pads and pens at your tables. It was too good of an opportunity to like talk about engagement and then not expect you all to engage at least a little bit. So we would love for you to take just 5 minutes and just reflect on the spaces. These might be the spaces that like you personally spend time in. It might be this room, which certainly communicates things to people. We were talking about this just earlier, unprompted. Or better yet, dig into some of the properties that you own, manage, work on, because I'm assuming most of you do, and think a little bit about what those spaces are communicating to you or to the residents that are using those spaces. And I'd love for you just to spend 5 minutes, write down notes by yourself. We would really love if this didn't just live in discussion, but you actually like left a bunch of stickies on the table for us so that we can collect them afterwards and just, at least have a one-sided conversation. But, talk to each other, leave some notes, just spend 5 minutes kind of reflecting on that. And then I'll pass it over to Irene. Thank you.
All right, we'll give you another minute to sort of wrap up your conversations. Oh, that's okay. Okay. We'll give another 10 seconds. Okay, sure. One more minute. We got one more minute. Okay. I see lots of good conversation. I'm so sorry to cut it off. Um, but I'm glad that everyone is discussing. Maybe does anyone want to share maybe like one or two folks before we move on to my piece? Anyone want to share kind of what you talked about? Yeah, go ahead. Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Biases only get challenged when there's communication, effective communication. So the more that people talk, the more that you will see multiple sides of the story. And sometimes it may feel like when I'm speaking, oh my God, she's gonna cost us more money and time, and we have to redo stuff because she's actually right. And that feels that feels that feels like we all suffer, we all have challenges with money and time. Those are the top resources that we worry about. But taking even a minute just to hear someone that is in it, you know, firsthand at the ground level will really help. Yes, it will change. Yes, it will take more time, more money, but it will be a better outcome.
So I'm going to expand on that because, so Michelle and I were both coming at this from the standpoint of being designers, and that the best projects happen when we're allowed to listen to property management, to service providers, to representative tenant voice, that one in particular, when we're doing this work. But that even though we can say that's a best practice and that's going to make a better project, we're still at the mercy of the owner to be willing to let us have a really engaged community process. And so my ask to Shay was just to keep being that advocate, that that's an important part of the process. And you all being up here and talking about the importance to a room full of people that are different members of the team is really important, because the best projects have all of these voices. Otherwise, they're full of bias and they don't feel good to be in the end. And you want to expand, Michelle?
Yeah.
Just as another designer in the room, I think we need to give ourselves collective permission to push a little bit, right? And to push a couple times, and like all respect to all the owners in the room. But we do our best work, and our best work for you includes these voices. And we do a really good job when we have constraints, and we do a pretty mediocre job when we don't understand what those constraints really need to be. So I think collectively, as a profession, as a series of design professions, we need to push more. Because I find that people tend to be responsive and open to it when they understand why we're pushing.
Thank you for sharing. This is a great segue into my talking points, and you pretty much made my talking points. I'm wondering if I should even do this right now. No, but yeah, like, how do we push the needle? And that's kind of what I would really love to talk about. Like, what's my clicker? And right, how do we change how we do this? And so I want to just offer some kind of 3 big moves that how we can reframe community engagement practice towards design justice. A lot of these might like resonate with a lot of you. And hopefully we'll have some time for discussion, but would love to have some time for Q&A as well. So I'll try to leave some room for that. Okay, so the first kind of big move that I'll offer here is that community engagement is not just about bringing people to meetings, getting their feedback, incorporating it into your design or whatever it is. To me, community engagement is all about relationship building, and that's where it should start. It's really about bridging the gap between those who have power and those who don't. And what I mean by that is it means designing spaces, programs, and services with them and not for them, right? I know we've all heard that before, but I think it's really true and really important. So I just want to offer, you'll see a pattern here with my slides. I'm not an architect, so I don't have like nice, pretty images to show, but I wanted to offer some sort of best practices to take with you, things that I've really thought about and have incorporated into my work as well. But so 2 things you can do to bridge that gap. Building a network of folks who can help bridge the power gap. So we've talked about this. One of the hardest things in engagement is really getting folks at the table. And building their capacity to be involved and informed and providing informed feedback. So, and it's really, really challenging, especially with frontline communities who don't have the time, agency, and ability to participate. So there are resident services, there's community organizers, there's resident advisory boards. A lot of housing developers have partnerships with community-based organizations and other service providers, community leaders who directly work with tenants and residents and unhoused populations. So build those relationships with them. I worked with them on projects, and they are very critical in convening and being a liaison between me, the facilitator, the engagement person, and getting the feedback that is going to be meaningful and have impact. So they can, so yes, and they also can help people feel comfortable in those spaces, right? It's intimidating to come to a meeting and a workshop when you don't know like what's going on, like even something as simple as seeing a familiar face and you know, helping kind of bridge and build that safe space is really important. But also, as you just talked about, resident services, community organizers are also stakeholders themselves. They can provide input on, you know, building design, how you provide those services, where are those challenges and gaps that you're finding, and, you know, building maintenance, what materials you're using, things like that, that are really important as a designer and getting that feedback. So really building those relationships with those stakeholders and bringing them into the process is really important. The second thing I'll offer is I would say a necessary component of building resident capacity to participate is to offer compensation. I cannot stress this enough. What compensation means is that I'm acknowledging and honoring their time, experience, expertise, their contributions to this project, just as I'm getting paid to consult in a project. So, you know, build compensation into your budget and make sure that folks, you're valuing people's time. So the second big move is to engage residents and unhoused populations through a trauma-informed lens. So why do we want to do this? Because the risk of not doing that is you risk re-traumatizing and harming communities without a trauma-informed approach. So, and it can really damage relationships and trust with residents, with tenants and other frontline communities that you might be engaging with. So I'm not a trauma-informed trainer. I've learned through practicing and learning from my peers and from different projects, but that, you know, taking a trauma-informed approach to engagement is always at the forefront of my mind, especially when I'm working with affordable housing projects. Because, you know, I'm talking to folks who are experiencing houselessness and working through lots of different traumas, and I don't want to unintentionally, you know, kind of recreate sort of the trauma or the distrust that they've been feeling by institutions over and over again. So two things that I'll offer to keep in mind is never overpromise. Most, if not all, residents that I've engaged with in affordable housing related projects have had very, you know, pretty negative experiences with agencies and institutions. There's deep distrust due to a lot of false promises that have been made. And so it's absolutely critical to set realistic expectations and be transparent about what opportunities are and are not possible and explain why. Also, ask questions that can actually influence the outcome, right? I don't want to ask questions knowing that it's actually not going to help and have a meaningful impact. So really be thoughtful about the questions you ask and why you're asking them. The second thing I'll offer is to value process over outcome. So engaging communities early in the process, as Brian has mentioned, really bring them along and in an iterative process. And building in those opportunities for feedback and collaboration is at really every milestone of a design and development process. And then most importantly, making sure that they can visibly see how their voices are creating something positive and are reflective of their concerns and priorities, right? So show that you are listening to them. And so, again, that builds trust and that relationship as well. And then the third thing I'll offer is a big move is to center those who are directly impacted by development. So I'm mostly mentioning this through kind of a lens of like neighborhood opposition. I know lots of folks have dealt with this. I've dealt with this in some of my projects too. And yeah, there's a lot of stigma and myths about affordable housing developments and there's, opposition can really put a wedge in the success of a development, right? So if you know that there's going to be loud voices in the room, different power dynamics and things like that, I think it's important to have an open dialogue with them, right? But also be thoughtful about when and how you have that dialogue. And always keep coming back to the values of process. So, coming back to that, all of these housing developments that all of us are working on are going to have life-changing impacts to families experiencing or who have experienced homelessness. So, and then, all of that relationship building is not going to matter if we're not centering those experiences anyways, right? And really thinking back at who is this for, who is this benefiting? So 2 things I'll offer again, kind of as a best practice is to start with those shared values and set expectations. Set the tone of the process by setting boundaries of what's on and off the table with those neighborhoods. Also with the folks like the residents and the tenants who might be living in these developments, but also with the neighbors as well. Get consensus about shared values among all stakeholders, especially the skeptics, and be solutions oriented and be clear about your intentions for that development. Also, I'm not going to say that this is like a silver bullet, best practice, right? It's, development is messy. These engagement processes are messy. It can get really complicated, and it's really tricky to navigate. But I think, grounding everyone on those shared values and always being able to point back to that and say, hey, remember, we said that this is something that we cared about, and we can always point back to it and set those expectations. The second is to create safe space without exploiting lived experiences. So what I mean by this is be mindful of who you bring into a space and how you have conversations with tenants, with those frontline communities, and be aware of the power dynamics at play. And also do your research and how all these, what intentions, what perceptions are all these different stakeholders bringing to the table. And that tells me like that, right? I'm not gonna bring a neighborhood association representative into a public design workshop for residents because I don't know what they're gonna say. I don't know, it's just not a space for them. And create a different space where you could still listen to those folks, but not exploit all, other people's experiences to someone who probably has more power than they do. So that's just something to be thoughtful about as you, think about how you engage these folks. So I want to share just a couple project examples as well to sort of put a finer point on these best practices. So one project I'll share about is this was with Catholic Charities. There's a former employee here at Catholic Charities. I don't know, he might have worked on this project, but it's now called Francis Sinclair Place. But before, when we were working on it back in 2021, it was the project was called St. Francis Development Visioning. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with this site, but it's in the Buckman neighborhood. And Catholic Charities owns kind of this kind of rectangular block where they have the St. Francis Park Apartments. That's, very beautiful building. There's a little park space above it. And then on the very north end of the block, there was a dining hall and St. Francis Parish. And then so this little yellow rectangular kind of box that you see is where they wanted to develop more housing and provide permanent supportive services. And there's a lot of tension with the neighborhood and Catholic Charities because this neighborhood, so St. Francis Parish was running a dining hall and providing food to houseless folks out of that parish. And it caused a lot of tensions with neighborhoods because the concern was like, the concerns that I was hearing was like, you're just putting a Band-Aid on this, right? You're not providing those holistic services that houseless folks really need. And it's creating a lot of kind of a sense of, kind of people not feeling safe in the neighborhood and things like that. So they brought us in as a third-party facilitator to sort of help tease some of those concerns out, get on the same page about what we are actually intending to do, and start to kind of unpack some of those concerns as well, but also get their feedback on like what, how to manage these types of services and create some like social cohesion in the neighborhood as well, and what their responsibility is in that. So this is I kind of a little diagram of our engagement process. We had stakeholder interviews with we started off doing individual interviews with all the neighborhood association representatives, business owners in the neighborhood who were really concerned. But also we did focus groups with houseless folks and the tenants in St. Francis Park Apartments, because we wanted to hear the full perspective, right? But I also wanted to do individual interviews before bringing them into a community advisory group. And then, not knowing what they're going to say or what perspectives they're bringing into the table. So I kind of want to do my own research and make sure that I could tease out some of those common values that everyone was telling me and bring that to the table when we first met. So at the get-go, we set those engagement goals, right? Like the point of this process is to identify key values, everyone's shared common values, and then also more tangibly, potential long-term uses and services that reflect stakeholder values, but also align with Catholic Charities' Healthy Housing Initiative. So they have a mission, right? We have to meet that mission to end homelessness. And that is the end goal. And just constantly reminding folks of that, right? The option is not to build. It's going to happen, but we all have to be on the same page about how that happens. Secondly is, and a second kind of expectation that we set is that we will always center the challenges and needs of people experiencing homelessness in the engagement process, and regarding kind of potential, and also regarding potential new development. So really, again, as I said before, verbalizing that and really making sure that that's on top of the agenda as like, remember, this isn't about like your kind of perceptions of what safety is, or like how to deal with homelessness, or just like relocating them somewhere else, right? Those were comments that were said. That's not a solution, and that's not on the table. We want to figure out how to provide these programs and holistic services that serve everybody. So I just want to give a glimpse of sort of kind of these like principles that I've shared in this particular project. So I think it's under construction right now. They broke ground in September. Yeah, I'm not getting nodding heads. So really exciting. So this next one I want to share, this is a project we're working on right now with Victor Caesar at VHA. And we started this project sort of they wanted to understand how to kind of be more strategic about the development decisions they make, just more big picture. So we've been able to do a pretty robust engagement process. We interviewed community-based organizations, developers and housing authority, other housing authorities. We did resident listening sessions with some of the developments at VHA, senior housing, youth housing, and family housing. And we also did more broader outreach through a survey to VHA residents. And the goal was to really get their perspective on how is the building working for you? What programs and services are working for you? What's not working for you? Where can improvements be made? And sort of see kind of what is working, what partnership opportunities are there, what recommendations can we provide to VHA in the full spectrum of the development. So from planning, the financing decisions, the programming and services, to how you design a building, to how you lease and occupy that development. So this is like a map of basically how we start to organize all of the feedback that we receive through all these different methods, and sort of starting to see like where they lie, right? And so we're working on this project report now, but I just wanted to share it's just been really insightful to see how all of this feedback can inform every stage of development. So I'll end there and see if I'll open up for any questions, but we also have a discussion activity as well, similar to what we just did before. Oh, sorry, I skipped a slide. So in summary, I think the things to take away here is to cultivate awareness, again, be trauma informed and be aware of the impact of oppressive systems on vulnerable communities, center lived experiences, compensate them for their participation, and make sure that those lived experiences are always at the forefront of discussions. And then relationship building, form follows feelings. Start with those relationship building and make sure that that's really part of the process, and that's the intention with the process. It's not about just getting feedback, but it's about how do you do community build during your full process. And then I know a lot of us have heard this before, but move at the speed of trust. I know as a consultant, we're always constrained by budget and time and trying to wrap up projects within like a 6 to 9 month period, and which I get, but it makes it really hard when you have a timeline, but you're also wanting to make sure that community members are following us, right? Are coming with us in this process. So, and that just takes time. So I encourage everyone to, build a little bit of flexibility in your timelines, and provide budget for compensation. But yeah, those are kind of the key takeaways here. And I don't know, do you have anything to add? Okay. So any questions? I'll open it up. Yeah, go ahead. I'll hand the mic to you.
Hi, thank you. So you're working with a community, you're centering those, who are going to be directly impacted. There's some power dynamics in the room which have been recognized. You're taking on some big questions, and disagreements arise. How is conflict handled? And in the end, when you kind of like need to get to a decision about something in particular in order to move on, what are the different strategies for making those decisions in the group do you use, and how do you know when to use which strategy?
Good question. So the first part was like, how do you deal with conflict? Yeah, I think, sometimes you have to be able to just pause, right? And just step back and say, okay, let's like readjust kind of our strategy here. If there are folks like, for instance, that St. Francis example, in the meeting, things got really intense, right? There's anger involved. And so at that point, I kind of, as a facilitator, keep calm, but kind of gently and firmly come back to, this is the goal here, right? And I understand that you're angry, but, and we could talk offline to have that conversation, but this is not the space to do that. And so it's kind of diffusing the tension a little bit, but being willing to pause and just say, okay, something's not right here. Let's pause this discussion. Maybe have some side conversations if you need to have them, like separately or at another time, and then come back, right, and follow up. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I've dealt with, particularly high tense situations. Yeah. And
then decision making in the group.
Yeah, could you repeat that question again?
Sure. Yeah. So recognizing some of the power dynamics and the lived experiences there, when a particular decision needs to be made in order to move on, what are the strategies for making those decisions? For example, is it consensus? Is it a vote? Is it a reverse vote or whatever? Are there some kind of strategies that you use?
Yeah, so consensus is a really good strategy, but you also have to define what consensus is. Consensus doesn't always have to mean everyone has to 100% agree and like be 100% for this, right? They could establish there's like a spectrum of consensus. I think there's like a really great chart where it's like there's 5 levels of consensus. There's like, the fist of 5 or something like that. Yeah. And so, consensus could also mean like, can I just live with this, right? Am I okay enough that I could move on from this? And so kind of setting those expectations in the forefront and saying like, we have to all kind of be on the same page about this. And it's okay if you're not 100% happy, but that's not what we're going for. We want to just be at a point where you're okay, you can live with it, right? And move forward. So I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, I want to acknowledge that this is great work and applaud like the design community, I guess, for taking this approach because it's really bigger than design. And my only question is, it's kind of detailed, but how is the decision or determination made about how much is enough compensation for community partners?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. I'm going to be honest, there are times when we just don't have the budget to compensate folks fairly. And so we sort of provide compensation with what we are able to do at that point. But, if we're to just literally put a number to it, $50 to $100 is for an hour of their time is like a good benchmark to think about. Because you think about what consultants get paid and it's not, I don't know, they are providing they're being vulnerable, they're sharing their experience and providing their input and contributing their time. And I feel like that's kind of a fair way to think about it. And so, yeah, it depends on the budget. This is why I'm like, build in the budget to compensate. But yeah, I would say that would be, I don't know if others have other suggestions, but that's typically how I've thought about it. Yeah. Oh, also I'll add with compensation, sometimes like we do gift cards and things like that. And sometimes it's good. Like, I would say providing option, like doing a Visa gift card is better than like a specific place. So they could have more options to spend it. But also, yeah, I think, yeah, that's kind of a little tip to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, I would, one of your points was about kind of managing expectations and not over promising. And I guess I'm curious about, at least when I think of our projects, a lot of them have to be pretty fully designed by the point that we submit like to the NOFA applications and those type of things. And how do you manage expectations and not overpromise when there's this, you're doing all of this community outreach, you're really getting people involved, and there's this chance that it doesn't get funded this cycle. And like, you're going to have to communicate back out to the community, like, we didn't get funded, it's going to take another year. And how do you continue to build that trust with that community when that's a very real possibility?
Honesty, right? I mean, this system is broken. Right. I think that I'm not going to get too many people upset with me for saying that in this room, right? Like, this system is so complicated. Everybody we're inviting to the table is an expert in housing, right? If you are a single parent with 3 kids, you are an expert in housing. You live in a house, or you don't live in a house, but you need to live in a house, right? Like, you are an expert in housing. You deserve to be treated with the respect that anybody would be when they're brought to the table. And so in that way, I think we need to explain and own how challenging this process is, right? And we're doing our best and we're advocating for you, and they need to see us advocating for them, not just saying that, right? But when it comes to things that are so far outside of our control, like the selection within a NOFA process, we just need to be honest.
Actually related to that question, I am curious to know what kind of strategies you found to be effective in continuing to communicate with folks that you're engaging with, specifically those who are potential residents for a project, those more vulnerable communities that you're wanting to center. How do you continue to keep them informed after you've engaged with them?
I don't have the magic answer, right? I mean, it's hard, especially when people have Wi-Fi phones and are hard to get a hold of and keep track of, and the development process slows down. And what we think of as, a quick turnaround and a quick decision has to run through 4 different levels of power. And all of a sudden it's been 3 months and the community's pissed at us, right? Like, this happens. And the best thing we can do is continue to check in with people as often as we can, and kind of keep them posted. And sometimes that works better than it does other times. But again, just like that honesty up front to explain the system as much as we can and offer that education, and just let them know, you know, these things are probably going to come up and we're going to do our best to kind of continually be in touch. And then there's just the cycle as far as the design process itself, you know, it's a cycle of listening and showing and listening again and showing again, and right. And just like that iteration builds trust. But so much of it, I think so many of these questions for me come down to the more you can spend time building trust before we're drawing things, before we're submitting for NOFAs, the better, right? Like you need that trust at the table before you're asking something of somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what I'll add to that is that, yes, I totally agree. And also that following up is really important. Following up and telling people, okay, here was the outcome. It might not have been what you wanted, but again, it goes back to the honesty thing, right? Like we're all doing the best we can to, yeah, make the right decision. So the follow-up, I've even followed up, you know, after, especially if I have like interviews or there's community members where I've like built a lot of rapport with and trust with, and, you know, they're sharing with me kind of a lot of, you know, experiences, really tough things that they've gone through. And I'm like sort of incorporating that feedback into, you know, a summary or whatever. I want to follow up with them and say, hey, did I capture this right? Like, I don't want to misrepresent anything, right? And also unintentionally exploit their experiences in the wrong way. So that follow-up of like, you know, again, building that trust and like, just, you know, being authentic and honest about like, I want to do this right and make sure that I'm capturing your voice in the right way. And yeah, doing that follow-up with them is really important. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, this has all been really great. And I don't want to make my question too complicated, but it feels like all the things bubbling that I have been struggling with in terms of engagement specific to housing for a long time. You know, I think some of you touched on an idea that I want to amplify too, which is that in order for an engagement process to not be extractive, I think not only is the compensation piece important, but you know, it really needs to be about capacity building and everyone who's attending, right? That's the value that we can give back. So in that light, you know, there's certainly projects that have like public projects that have a lot of variables to them, right? A lot of input is really going to be utilized. And there's, you know, housing projects where there's existing residents who are going to be impacted. And that is a pretty clear opportunity for engagement and, you know, making sure that that's done well. But a lot of new housing projects, right? We don't even know who the residents are going to be necessarily. They have these tight timelines and NOFAs and, you know, thinking about doing this process well. And then knowing that housing often has few variables, at least in the mind of the owner and in how much money we can spend. So you don't want to like, you know, bring a bunch of people in who might not even be able to be housed ultimately in the project, right? You can't guarantee that. Their input might not affect very much. We've already like have a library of really good best practices. Like, is there a point at which, how do you decide, you know, can an engagement process be done well enough to justify it and not cause more harm versus just not doing it in some of these cases? Like, I think that's
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is it okay to not do engagement? Like, is it like, and I think that option should, I might be saying something controversial here, but like right, like you don't want to ask people things just to ask them. It's a waste of their time. So, you know, really be thoughtful about why you're engaging folks. What's the objective and what are you trying to get out of it? And that is actually, you know, going to amplify their voice to actually influence the outcome. If you know that that's not going to happen, yeah, think about maybe what's the right level of engagement here then? That maybe you don't need to engage the whole, like, all like a larger group of people or whatever, but really think about who the stakeholders are then that you can be really helpful to your process. Yeah, I don't know if you have it.
Sure, yeah. I think that there's an element of scaling. There's definitely an element of scaling, right? I have a hard time committing to projects that don't do some amount of outreach and engagement, right? Otherwise, I'm only repeating what's been done before or what rumors I've heard from past projects before. And sometimes that gets scaled down to a handful of conversations. But I think if those handful of conversations are placed at the right time and in the right place, they can be incredibly impactful, right? Like, I don't actually believe that engagement has to add a lot of time or a lot of cost to a project. I think that when you look at what we did for PCC or for the Holgate Library, that's a whole nother conversation, right? Like, you need to build in at least 6 to 8 weeks for every cycle of engagement happening at that level. That's appropriate for some housing developments. It's certainly not appropriate for all. I think personally, I always push pretty hard to have at least a couple of focus groups before we ever put pencil to paper. I think that's super important before we submit for a NOFA, right? Like, otherwise, all we're doing is we're hitting copy paste on the last program that came along to us. And I think to your point that, housing doesn't have, I don't remember your exact words, but doesn't have that many moving pieces or that many variables in it, right? Like, to some extent, I agree. And I think that 80% of our housing projects should be, largely repetitive, right? From a cost efficiency standpoint, from a construction efficiency standpoint, like from our fee standpoint, like, yes, right? Let's keep soft costs down for sure. But let's identify that unique 15 to 30% on every single project. And let's push really hard into how we have meaningful conversations about that 15 to 30%. And so I think there's always a window. And I think that we always need to be elevating others' voices in the conversation, or we're just missing it. Right. But I do think we need to scale it. I totally agree.
I saw, we have 1 more minute. We have 1 more minute. I saw, question back there.
There we go. Yeah, just building on that a little bit. The community, I was really impressed by the idea of hiring kind of these community-based design advisors, training them, having them go out into their communities, kind of doing the foot soldier work of explaining and then bringing that information back to the larger group. And I'm wondering, were there any challenges to that in terms of those folks standing in for a much larger group that they were representing? Because sometimes representation can be a super challenge when we're just shortcutting to get to what does this group as a whole think. But I think in terms of just like another tool in the toolbox of really extending beyond what your client's list of who their favorites are, like that's a really great way of widening that circle. And I just wanted to get a little bit more information about that process.
Yeah, absolutely. There are certainly challenges, right? And so in that one, we really leaned into co-locate our design partner on both the Opportunity Center and the library. Felt pretty strongly that the designers shouldn't be at the table for a good number of those conversations, right? And that we wouldn't get as open and as honest and transparent a conversation if we were. And as much as we love to be at the table for conversations, we heard that and respected that, and we weren't. And so I think that there were lessons learned. There are some things that probably got lost in translation that we might have been able to kind of add another layer of depth to the intention behind something. And we might have interpreted what we heard a little bit differently because we do actually have a lot of training in listening and interpreting, right, from conversation to design elements. So lessons learned, jury's still out to some extent. Biggest challenge was that time cycle, was building in the cycle of what it takes for us to generate the presentation materials unique to each one of those community design advisors to go out to that community to have the conversation that they thought needed to happen, not the conversation we need to happen, right? So that took real time. I think the value, especially in like a library project, right, was really there in the end. And at the core of what I do personally, I come from a world of asset-based community development. Architecture and creating space and building communities are one small part of this much broader community development initiative or lens or umbrella that I see myself at least practicing within. I'm not an affordable housing architect. I'm a community development designer, right, or architect. And so when I think about it that way, it calls into question like the whole architectural process that I was trained into and the biases, right, that we got in school. And so I think in that way, letting other people fumble through these conversations instead of fumbling through them ourselves all the time is really eye-opening. right? And their fumbles and you know, follies can be brilliance as well. I think we need to make space for that.
Okay, I think that's the end of our session. We had one discussion question, but maybe I'll just leave you with this. Hopefully a lot of these kind of things that we shared resonate with you. Maybe think about what resonates with you the most, what challenges, fears you have about implementing these practices. But also, I think the key takeaway here is like, you know, not every process is perfect. There's not a silver bullet solution to all of these challenges we're facing, but I think these are all good things to keep in mind and yeah, build into your process. So thank you. Thanks for attending.